This is an NBC News special report. Here is Tom Brokaw.
The dramatic atrium of the President John F. Kennedy Museum and Library, hard by the sea in Boston, the archival home of Camelot. And it was from here this morning that the last of the Kennedy brothers, the youngest of those brothers, Senator Edward Moore Kennedy, began his final journey to Washington, D.C. First, a funeral mass here in his beloved Boston, and then a delayed military flight to Washington, where there will be a motorcade through the nation's capital and burial ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery beside his late brother, President John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy. Those two Kennedys served in the United States Navy. Senator Kennedy served in the United States Army. We are going to go now to the nation's capital, where a number of Senate staffers and members of the Senate, where Senator Kennedy served for 47 years, the third longest in American history, are gathered on the steps so they can pay their final tribute to this man who left such a deep imprint on the nation. And there have been so many tributes to him in the last 2 days, not just from Democrats, but from Republicans alike. Senator Orrin Hatch here at the library last night, and Senator John McCain talking about his ability to reach across party lines. NBC's Tom Costello is there at the Capitol.
Tom, good afternoon to you, and this is really a very poignant and really an astonishing, I think, afternoon here on the steps of the Capitol. And to give you some perspective, we're on the east steps, so I am literally looking behind the camera is the Supreme Court. And behind me are the staffers. We're guesstimating somewhere between 500 and maybe 800 who are now waiting for Senator Kennedy to arrive in the funeral procession. Among those who are here, you'll see Congressman Dingell, the longest serving member of the Congress ever. Also Senator Byrd, he is in a wheelchair. A moment ago, they wheeled him back. It has been an oppressively hot day here in Washington. But these are current and former staffers, and many of them having served with Senator Kennedy and for Senator Kennedy on his staff over the course of the past 4 decades and more. We've also got some incredible pictures of the crowd here, estimated by the Capitol Hill Police Department in the immediate grounds around the Capitol to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 4,000. And many, if not all, are carrying these small little plastic American flags. At some point, you might expect them to wave those flags as the funeral procession moves by. I think it's probably important to point out that this is all to honor a politician. And it probably is unusual to honor a politician who has not made it to the White House in this fashion. I'm not sure that many others in the Congress would receive this kind of welcome and outpouring of love and admiration and a very public farewell on this very hot and, as we said, oppressive August day here in the nation's capital. We expect that, in fact, the procession will arrive here within the hour. And when it does arrive, we are told that it will move here along Independence Avenue, stop right in front of the Capitol building, right in front of his beloved Senate, where, as you mentioned, he spent 47 years of his life. And there is a microphone set up there. We believe that the chaplain of the House will deliver remarks, offer a prayer. We don't know if any member of the Kennedy family will be speaking, although that certainly is an option to them should they desire to speak to the staffers who have come out on a Saturday when the Congress is in recess to pay their respects. And then from there, the procession will move on down to Constitution Avenue, down along the Mall, all the way over the Potomac River and into Arlington and Arlington National Cemetery. They're running behind schedule, so we are still waiting along with the rest of the nation and everybody here. Tom?
Thanks very much, Tom Costello. However you may feel about Senator Kennedy's politics, the fact is that this kind of tribute for a man who served in the United States Senate is unique. It's not that he wasn't interested in being president. As he once said, frankly, I don't mind not being president. I just mind that someone else is. He made an ill-fated run, of course, in 1980. There was speculation in 1968 that he would step in for his martyred brother, Robert F. Kennedy, but that did not come to pass. Today, in his eulogy, President Obama said at the funeral service here in Boston about Ted Kennedy, the greatest expectations were placed upon Ted Kennedy's shoulders because of who he was, but he surpassed them all because of who he became. And the Kennedy family continues to have a hold on American on American politics and on the American culture. We're going to get some perspective on that now from NBC's consulting historian Michael Beschloss, who joins us now from our Washington studios. Michael, 100 years from now, historians, people in your field of work, will be looking back not just on this day, but on this time of the Kennedys, and trying to assess the true and lasting impact and what, in fact, was the magic of their hold.
Well, you know, I think, Tom, what historians 100 years from now might say is what Ted Kennedy is about to say in the memoir about to come out. One of the few things that we know that's in that book is he says, I came to realize late in life that my history was inextricably linked with that of my brothers and my family. And I think that's the way historians will look on this. They'll say that from about the late 1950s until almost 2009, the Kennedys dominated a large part of American politics, and they'll say that it was like other ways that don't have to do with elective office.
We want to remind everyone, Michael, that we're told now that the Motorcade is moving from Andrews Air Force Base. It will be unimpeded by the normal traffic congestion that you might expect. The flags flying at half-staff at the nation's capital and federal buildings across the country until Sunday night on orders of President Obama. When they get to Arlington, we want to remind you as well that the ceremonies will take place at the site of the Eternal Flame. That was the idea of the late Jacqueline Kennedy, later Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, as a way to honor her husband, President John F. Kennedy, who was murdered in Dallas in November of 1963. The brothers will be joined there, and there are other members of the family as well. An unnamed child that was miscarried by Mrs. Kennedy, and then another infant that died shortly after childbirth. So that will happen at Arlington. There are about 27 burials that are occurring there every day. And there's been a backlog, frankly, of those who were killed in Iraq or in Afghanistan. They've been told that they have to wait because there is such a burden in getting these ceremonies conducted. 27 a day, everyone gets a military caisson and the full attention of Arlington, which includes an honor guard and a bugler and a military chaplain as well. So the ceremonies are underway, and when the motorcade now is underway, headed toward the nation's capital, where President Kennedy once served, and then when he was elected president, 2 years later, he managed to work it out with the governor of Massachusetts at the time to appoint an interim senator so that his brother, Edward Moore Kennedy, could become 30 years old and run for that office, which he did, and win. It was an epic election in 1962 here in Massachusetts. The nephew of the Speaker of the House, John McCormick, was running against Ted Kennedy in the primary. And then in the general election, George Cabot Lodge from the famous Cabot family and the Lodge family ran against him in the general election. Cabot Lodge later became a good friend of Senator Kennedy's and said we were both so young at the time, there were very few differences between us because I was a liberal Republican. Andrea Mitchell is also in our Washington studio. And Andrea, we're going to talk a little politics here. It's only natural on a day like today. We'll hear in a few moments the eulogy that Senator Kennedy's eldest son delivered, Ted Kennedy. And there's already some buzz going on in Boston that he may be the man that will fill his father's seat. They have not yet worked it out. This will become critical, obviously, in the days and weeks to come as the senator's prize, his passion, national health care plan, it becomes more and more the centerpiece of the legislative battle on Capitol Hill. What are you hearing about the possibility that the governor of Massachusetts, in fact, will appoint someone to hold the seat, even though state law says you must have an election?
I think that that is very likely, in fact, and I think that Teddy Kennedy would have loved the fact that we're talking politics today. That was his passion, it was his occupation and his great love. And in fact, Deval Patrick is moving in that direction. They need to get some votes through the legislature, but they do want to appoint a caretaker. There's ample precedent for that. It is occurring right now with Senator Kaufman in Delaware, a caretaker that is believed to be holding that seat until Joe Biden's son Joe Biden having vacated the seat, Joe Biden's son comes back from Iraq. So there is a lot going on behind the scenes. There's a lot of talk, as you point out, about Ted Jr., who gave that extraordinary eulogy today. There could be rivalry from cousin Joe Kennedy. So former congressman active in helping the poor get lower cost energy and could possibly be a rival. There are other members of the delegation. I think if anyone with the name of Kennedy chooses to go for the seat, it would be theirs. But there would be other members of the congressional delegation. That is a very active delegation. You have some members who have taken themselves out of contention, like Barney Frank, because of his seniority as housing chairman, housing and banking chairman. But there are others, even those in great power, like Ed Markey, who, while shepherding energy legislation through, might want to take another look at that seat, particularly because you don't have to resign from the House to run for the Senate, Tom.
All right, thank you, Andrew. Part of the condition may be, of course, that if Governor DeVille Patrick names someone, that the Republicans will insist that that person can not run for a full term in 2 more years. So we'll see how all that plays out. We want to share with you now just one of those well. To remind you where we are now, the motorcade is moving toward the nation's capital, toward the Senate building, where Senator Kennedy had a hideaway office, really, a very small nook up in one of the coveted places not too far from the Senate chamber, filled with the memorabilia of his life, including notes from his brothers and from his mother as well, commenting on his manners and on his school record. And it was in that hideaway office that he would often strike the deals or bring in people that he wanted to go to work for them, men who went on to become some of the nation's most prominent lawyers. Greg Craig, who is now general counsel to the White House, worked for him. Justice Breyer on the Supreme Court worked for Ted Kennedy as well. David Boies, the well-known national litigator, worked for him. The entire Capitol is infused with people who passed through Kennedy's staff at one time or another. And as the senator today, as they paid tribute to him, among those President Obama, he has his name on more pieces of legislation than any man or any woman in modern American political history, maybe if we were to do a national count, than anyone else who has served in what has been called the greatest deliberative body in the world. Savannah Guthrie is at the church now, what is called the Mission Church, here in a difficult neighborhood in Boston. It was there that the senator often worshiped as his daughter Kara was undergoing treatment for cancer. Savannah, what are they saying at the White House about what their hopes are for getting this Senate seat filled from Massachusetts, and what they think that they may be able to do with what they hope, I know, will be a kind of an emotional tidal wave to try to accelerate something to get done on health care?
Well, what you see is aides very publicly saying they won't get involved in Massachusetts politics, but I don't think there's any question whatsoever that they would like to see a senator seated as soon as possible, appointed as Senator Kennedy wished. This is clearly an important time on Capitol Hill with health care reform, really at this place where decisions need to be made. They need to go forward. It looks more and more like a bipartisan bill won't be happening, so it's all about Democrats, so they need this Democratic vote. And of course, this is an occasion where the White House has to walk that line. Certainly there is a lot of emotional heft here, a lot of weight behind the notion that Senator Kennedy, whose calling was health care reform, has now passed. And so there's some hope that there may be some momentum here. At the same time, they do not want to be seen as exploiting the senator's death in any way. So they may hope that there will be some inspiration drawn by this man who was able to make deals, who was a pragmatist, who liked to reach across the aisle, but also had an ability to corral fellow Democrats, all qualities badly needed as this Capitol returns in September to try to pass some health care reform.
Thanks, Savannah Guthrie. As you were talking, we were just watching these fascinating pictures from inside the church today. And, you know, in this case, these are all politicians, and they all have a sense, I think, that they watch these moments with some care, wondering how they'll be treated when they leave the public scene. Jack Nicholson, Tony Bennett, Bill Russell, who is one of the few people there today who could match the legend of Senator Kennedy in Boston, of course. Bill Russell who was the great captain of the Boston Celtics during that extraordinary run. There's never been never been equaled again in professional basketball. Secretary of State Clinton, there you see President Carter. A moment ago it was John McCain and Chris Dodd. Chris Dodd was the closest friend of Ted Kennedy's, the Vice President and former President George Bush. Mrs. Clinton was seated next to President Bush, who has just left office in this last year. We have no idea if they had any conversation or if they did, what they talked about. A little pat on the shoulder there from President Obama for his predecessor, Bill Clinton and Mrs. Clinton, the Secretary of State. Well, there's a little conversation going on there between the two of them, and an animated conversation between President Clinton and President Obama, who has been vacationing nearby on Martha's Vineyard. Back here at the library, which was dedicated in 1979, this site was chosen by Senator Kennedy because of its proximity to the sea in Dorchester, and the president's favorite sailboat is just outside here. At that dedication, Senator Kennedy said memorably about his brother, the late president, "He was best man at my wedding. He taught me to ride a bicycle, to throw a forward pass, to sail against the wind." And many of those sentiments were expressed today by his grandchildren and his nephews and nieces about the role that Senator Kennedy played in their lives, because Caroline Kennedy obviously lost her father. The children of Robert and Ethel Kennedy were without a father after that June day in 1968. And Edward Kennedy, Senator Ted Kennedy, stepped into the role of father for all of them, showing up at baptisms and school graduations and taking them all on camping trips. As his son said today, our family trips would leave us at the end of the day injured and exhausted. Let's go to Arlington National Cemetery now, and NBC's Jim Miklashevsky, who is normally posted at the Pentagon for us. Jim, what can we expect there when the ceremonies finally begin?
Well, you know, Tom, Senator Edward Kennedy was a frequent visitor here to Arlington National Cemetery, not only to visit the graves of his two brothers, President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, but also to visit Section 60, that area of Arlington National Cemetery, Tom, which you talked about earlier, where the casualties from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars are buried. Senator Kennedy would try to attend every single ceremony that involved a service member who died in either Iraq or Afghanistan who was from Massachusetts. Now, he'll come down Constitution Avenue, make one circle around the Lincoln Memorial, and then cross over the Memorial Bridge over the Potomac for the final time. He will arrive at the gravesite. Now, you know, President Kennedy had a state funeral with all the pomp and ceremony, including a horse-drawn caisson. Robert Kennedy had a very understated funeral. The family actually asked for a minimum of military participation, but once Senator Kennedy arrives at graveside, it will look like a full honors military ceremony. There will be a 9-man military casket team that will carry the casket to the graveside. Cardinal Theodore McCarrick will conduct a short ceremony, after which the officer in charge will snap a smart salute. There will be a volley of 3 shots from the 7-member rifle team, military taps, and then the American flag, once draped over his casket, having been folded, will then be handed to a member of the family, Tom.
All right, thanks very much, Jim Miklashevsky at Arlington. That, of course, is the stately place. It began to get even more attention when John F. Kennedy was buried there in 1963 with that eternal flame that Mrs. Kennedy decided that she would like to have burning constantly. It can be seen from across the Potomac. We have applause now on the steps of the Capitol from the staffers who are gathered there. These are, ladies and gentlemen, these are, for those of you who don't get to Washington very often, you're looking really at the heart and soul of the Capitol. These are young people, many of them, who come from all over America, Republicans and Democrats alike, from a wide variety of backgrounds to go to work on Capitol Hill. That's Senator Robert Byrd, who is the great lion of the Senate, as Ted Kennedy was called. Robert Byrd has written an exhaustive history of the Senate. He's from West Virginia, and almost every public building and highway in that state is a tribute to his ability to find appropriations for his home state, and many of them bear his name. Senator Byrd is there with John Dingell, who is not in the picture at the moment. And he and Senator Kennedy, Senator Byrd and Senator Kennedy, were two of the most outspoken and eloquent opponents of the idea of going to war in Iraq at a time when it was hugely unpopular for them to express that. It was a vote that Senator Kennedy was very proud of, voting against the authorization for war. But then, of course, he did become a great friend of those young men and women from Massachusetts who served in the war, and some of whom who lost their lives, including one young man who lost his life in a lightly armored Humvee. Senator Kennedy became involved with his family and then helped get legislation passed so that the Humvees would have the additional armor that everyone thought that they required. We're back on Capitol Hill, and Tom Costello, what can you tell us about what's going on there?
Well, that applause that you may have heard, Tom, was for Senator Byrd when they wheeled him out in a wheelchair. He had been here earlier, probably about an hour, hour and a half ago, but when the heat became rather intense and it became clear that the procession was going to be delayed, they took him back inside. When he came back out, as you heard just about 5 minutes ago or so, everybody on the steps of the Capitol applauded him. We are told now from our producers that the funeral procession left Andrews Air Force Base at approximately 5:45 or so. Therefore, that would mean it would be another half an hour, in total, I would think a half an hour to 40 minutes before it arrives here at the Capitol building. And good news for the people here, the heat and the humidity have died away. We now have a nice breeze, cloud cover, and for the thousands of people who are out on the public grounds, not as well as the folks there on the steps of the Capitol building, but out on the public grounds who have been waiting here now for the better part of 2 hours. They have some relief from the elements. A nice breeze has cooled down, and there are children, I would say, Tom, along with many, many, many parents, but children, young children, who have been here for hours with their little plastic American flags, anxious to wave them in this final farewell.
Tom Costello, I'm hearing that they moved a little more swiftly from Andrews than we normally would calculate, and they could be just moments away from arriving at the nation's capital. 6 to 8 minutes, is that the latest that we're hearing? As Tom has described for you, they will make a kind of rotation around the Capitol. There will be a tribute here on the Capitol steps. It will be quite brief. There will be a blessing, and then there will be a salute in effect to Senator Kennedy as the motorcade then goes away. It's a relatively small party that has accompanied the senator's body from Boston. Very inclement weather here in the Northeast off the stormy coasts of the North Atlantic. So family and friends went down, some on a military plane with the body, and then others on a charter that was arranged. They were about an hour delayed getting out of Boston today. I think it's fair to say it's been an emotional and draining experience for Boston, which has been, of course, the epicenter of the Kennedy family for so many years, for almost a century now in terms of their public exposure in the city. Joe Kennedy, the great patriarch of the family, went to Harvard, came from a very political family, came out and began making lots of money very early in the stock market, movies, and liquor. He, at the end of Prohibition, made arrangements to be the sole agent for some of the best-known brands in the world, an early supporter of Franklin Roosevelt, and then was named ambassador to Great Britain. And there's a little bit of irony in this burial at Arlington National Cemetery. One of his sons became president of the United States and a hero in World War II, which didn't hurt him in his run for the presidency. Another, Bobby Kennedy, obviously served at the end of World War II, and then Edward Kennedy, who served in the Army, will be buried at Arlington. And Joe Kennedy, in 1940, was an outspoken opponent of the participation of the United States in World War II. He thought that Great Britain was doomed, that the Germans would win there, and that he left that post in 1940 and came back to Washington, and then pretty much stayed out of sight for the duration of World War II because the United States was attacked by Japan, became quickly allied with Great Britain, and it made it possible for the Allies to win World War II. But right after the war, Joe Kennedy began to plan the ascendancy of his next son to the presidency. That would have been John F. Kennedy, because Joe Jr., his namesake, was killed in a heroic action during World War II, flying in an explosive-laden bomber that he was to parachute out of, and it was to become a weapon, but it blew up in midair. Andrea Mitchell, give us a quick update on the prospects for health care and the so-called public option, which was a big piece of the passion of Senator Kennedy for health care, to have the government be a major player in whatever bill was finally designed.
I think the best estimate now, coming out of this very difficult and abrasive summer debate, is that the public option really is not going to have any great chance of success. Some sort of co-op or scaled back option, some sort of compromise is going to have to be reached. And the informal deadline that the president set for Max Baucus of the Finance Committee and his gang of 6 was September 15th, Tom, that they come up with something. They will more likely come up with some sort of scaled back option, but it won't be the public option.
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We're told now that the motorcade is, in fact, just moments away, and we also want to take this opportunity to remind you that this coverage live on NBC and, of course, on MSNBC will continue, but some stations may be leaving us now, but we ask all of you to have patience. We'll be back in just a heartbeat. We're back with continuing NBC News live coverage of the arrival of the body of Senator Edward Moore Kennedy. For 47 years, one of the most active and, in fact, long-standing senators in the United States history, with more legislation to his credit than probably anybody else who served in that chamber. Everything from the Voting Rights Act to the Civil Rights Law to the Disabilities Act to Title IX, giving women the opportunity to compete at the same level of men in intercollegiate athletics. And of course, at the end of his career, his great passion, a national public health bill of some kind. He also, of course, became a lightning rod for a lot of criticism for his very outspoken resistance to the idea that Robert Bork would become a Supreme Court justice. He led the fight in what became a contentious and what many people believe was a landmark fight, and that it removed whatever civility might have existed about Supreme Court nominations from that time forward. Senator Kennedy was also not in favor of welfare reform, which is one of the signature issues of Bill Clinton's administration. He resisted that, but it passed, and the results of all that depend very much on your point of view, but in many instances people believe that it has helped move the country in a different direction in helping those who are less fortunate than others find their way in the workplace. For all of his wealth, and it was considerable, it's no one knows for sure, it's very privately held, the Kennedy Center wealth, but there are a lot of cousins and nephews and nieces that continue to live off the dividends. It's very privately managed from a small office on Park Avenue in New York. It is obviously in the billions of dollars right now. For all of his wealth and all of his privilege, Senator Kennedy was the most consistent, outspoken advocate on behalf of those who really had no representatives. He was the champion of those who had none, was the expression today used by President Obama. Michael Beschloss, I think that it's fair to say, however you feel about Senator Kennedy's ideology, he always walked the walk and talked the talk when he got on the Senate floor.
Yeah, he sure did. And, you know, you were talking about Joe Kennedy a moment ago, Tom. The interesting thing is, as you were saying, Joe Kennedy before World War II was a huge isolationist, also extremely conservative, so conservative that he thought seriously about converting to being a Republican. After the war, he supported his children, you know, John Kennedy when he ran for Congress in 1946 and ran in the 1950s, and then finally as president 1960 as a pretty thoroughgoing liberal. And he once said to JFK, you know, you're the person in public life, obviously, whom I love the most, and the person with whom I just about disagree the most. And John Kennedy once said about his father, you know, I think my dad would be for me even if I were a Marxist. Now, Ted Kennedy was a lot more liberal than JFK was, so you can imagine the gulf with Joe Kennedy.
And Michael, there was also that great line from Joe Kennedy about being willing to buy an election. He just didn't want to buy a landslide for his son.
Absolutely. That JFK's joke about his father. But, you know, the Kennedy fortune, as overwhelming as it was in 1960, John Kennedy's was probably the first self-funded presidential campaign. A lot of that paid for by the Kennedy fortune. Now it's not possible for the later generations to do that.
Michael, I wonder, as you look at the larger picture, with Senator Kennedy gone from the Senate floor, the last liberal lion in the truest sense of that, he believed, he was a great Federalist. He believed in the role of the federal government from the top down. Now, as you go across the country, you hear so many Democratic senators and governors and mayors saying, really, we ought to have the distribution of federal money, but let the cities and the states decide how best to use it. Do you think that we'll have any kind of seismic shift in how Washington has an impact across the country on social and other programs once we get out of this recession where there has been a lot of federal intervention?
Absolutely. Well, I think with the absence of Kennedy, what you'll see is Kennedy was perhaps the last great leader in the Senate who came out of a period in which big government and liberalism was pretty much unquestioned in certain quarters of the Democratic Party. Even now, the most liberal senators that you can find on the Senate floor grew up at a time of the 1970s and the 1980s, time of Ronald Reagan, where if you were a progressive Democrat and you got elected, you'd better explain yourself very well to voters who are a lot more skeptical.
You have Andrea Mitchell not too far away from you there as well. Andrea, we can't, I think, underestimate the importance of the endorsement of Senator Kennedy and Caroline Kennedy for Senator Obama, who was a man who was in the ascendancy when he was running just a year ago. But when the Kennedys, the two most familiar figures of the Kennedy family, came out for him and said he is the best hope to extend the vision of my brother John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy, it did have an enormous impact, didn't it, on the Democratic constituencies in the primary states that were still to come.
It certainly did, and even though Hillary Clinton went on to win some big victories on Super Tuesday after that endorsement, the fact that he validated, and Caroline did, validated the passing of the torch to this young African-American candidate who did not have a long track record in the Senate and with the Democratic Party nationally. That was such an important moment. It seemed at the time that it would have a huge impact. Then with the Super Tuesday victories of Hillary Clinton, people said, well, maybe it didn't, but it really did. In the long run, it was Teddy Kennedy vigorously going out and campaigning. He hit the road with Barack Obama, and he and Caroline and Maria Shriver in a big event in California made a huge impact on large numbers of voters in critical states. I think that embrace also at the Democratic Convention when he left his hospital bed and also said that he was determined to see the January swearing in, and he did on those steps the other side of the Capitol, of course the west front of the Capitol, that cold day, frigid day. We remember seeing him in the hat and the blue muffler, and he came out despite his chemotherapy and his treatments, braving the cold and also being in a crowd, which is not advisable for people whose immune system has been compromised. And then, of course, the terrible upset during the ceremonial luncheon later when he did collapse and went back into the hospital. So the drama of the past 15 months has just been extraordinary, and the battle that he fought with Vicky at his side, remarkable, but certainly had a lot to do, I think, with the way Barack Obama's election came out.
There was some very good-natured teasing among the cousins, however, some of whom had endorsed Hillary Clinton for president, and then Maria Shriver and Caroline Kennedy and Senator Kennedy endorsed Barack Obama. And in fact, Senator Kennedy made a memorable tour of California on President Obama's behalf. Maria Shriver was the First Lady of California. And guess who won? Hillary Clinton won California. So they were able to have a good laugh about that. Always competitive within the Kennedy family, whether it was touch football, sailing races, or certainly the great game of politics. I've just been told that the motorcade is now about 2 miles away altogether, and that they will have this brief stop here before going across the bridge after circling the Lincoln Memorial for the burial ceremony of Edward Kennedy. There's been a lot of talk, obviously, about is this the end of an era? You know, that's always a subjective judgment. But in fact, with the death of the last Kennedy brother, Gene Kennedy Smith is now the sole surviving member of that large clan that has been so much a part of the American political and cultural life for so long. But with the death of the last brother, the last public servant from the Kennedy family, who was a sibling of John F. Kennedy and Robert F. Kennedy, it is fair to say that an era has come to an end. And the Kennedys always talked in their political campaigns about the need for change. In fact, Senator Kennedy, when he was talking about Bobby Kennedy at his eulogy in 1968, cited Robert Kennedy's memorable speech in 1966 to young people in South Africa. That was at a time when apartheid was at its peak. Nelson Mandela was in jail. And he said, you are the young people who can move the world. And he cited Alexander the Great, Joan of Arc, reminding them that Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence at the age of 32. He said, the future does not belong to those who are content with today. Those were the words of Robert Kennedy, cited by Edward M. Kennedy in his eulogy at St. Patrick's Cathedral in 1968. And what has always been quite remarkable about Senator Kennedy, even at the age of 77, he had a youthful outlook and was constantly encouraging young people in a number of programs here in Massachusetts and across the country to get involved in public service and to leave their own imprint. I want you to look at these faces because this is the face of America here. These, as I said a few moments ago, are the people who come from across the country and go to work on Capitol Hill. Many of them stay for a long time. Some of them join Senate or congressional staffs and then run for office themselves or take positions in cabinet cabinet departments. Others of them go to K Street, as it's known, and become lobbyists. But something has happened in Washington in the past several years. Two young men came up to me just a couple of years ago, one a Democrat, one a Republican, and said they wanted to talk about the old days. I think that they meant 1996 when they were talking about the old days, but when I asked them what they meant, they said, well, my boss won't talk to his boss. My boss is a Republican, his boss is a Democrat, and they won't have anything to do with each other. And in fact, so many people in Washington on both sides of the aisle have said it has become a curse of modern governance and the modern political culture. That was something that Senator Kennedy and John McCain on the Republican side and others constantly tried to work against. At the end of the day, they tried to find that common ground that would move the nation forward. They didn't give up their fundamental principles. They continued to hold to their strongest beliefs. But they believe that in that building and in other buildings in Washington, the will of the people is best expressed when it moves forward with a common effort, a give here and a give there, so that the country doesn't become paralyzed by political incivility and meanness, for that matter. In his eulogy today, President Obama made reference to that. He said of Ted Kennedy, he was a product of a time when adversaries still saw each other as patriots. There was a fleeting reference to that as well by Ted Kennedy. Here comes the motorcade now, across the bridge into the nation's capital. These are the rituals of American life in your nation's capital. A public servant being honored for his years of service to the nation, representing the state of Massachusetts. In this case, the youngest member of a very robust clan of great wealth and privilege from the state of Massachusetts, the Commonwealth, as it's known, who came to Washington at the age of 30 to fill the unexpired term of his brother, the President of the United States, and stayed for 47 years. These are the kinds of rituals that are normally reserved for presidents of the United States. Rarely do you see a United States senator get this kind of response from not just across party lines, but from the public as well, in Washington, certainly in his home state here in Massachusetts, where he was a great champion of everything in the Bay State. The Red Sox, the Patriots, the historic sites. When he went out to Iowa to campaign, he was a little uncertain about how he could deal with the farm vote, because as he reminded everyone, the big crop in Massachusetts are cranberries, and he didn't think that the Iowa corn farmers could identify with that. There's been a lot of talk in the last 2 days, of course, about Senator Kennedy's his love of the sea. Ken Burns produced a remarkable short video essay last night at the memorial service, for the memorial service, showing the senator sailing his beloved wooden schooner, the Maya, giving orders to his grandchildren and kids on board. Senator John Culver, former senator from the state of Iowa, a football teammate at Harvard of Ted Kennedy's, gave a hilarious account of participating in a race with Ted Kennedy when John Culver, who, as he pointed out, came from Iowa and only knew about barges on the Mississippi River and nothing about sailing. It was a long and cold and stormy night and a long and cold following day in the Nantucket Regatta with an extra crewman that they picked up off the beach. And finally, they dragged home at about 11 o'clock at night. Senator Culver said he really never learned much about sailing, but he was always invited by his friend Ted Kennedy to go with him. The Greek islands, the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, off Hyannisport, and concluded to his friend, "Happy sailing, Ted, happy sailing." We're told the motorcade is now literally moments away. It's on South Capitol, about to make the turn into that side of the Capitol. The Supreme Court is on this end of the picture, obviously. And that's where the staffers are gathered, and many other people have lined the streets of Washington, D.C. to be a part of this today, as they have in Washington. It's estimated some 50,000 people passed by the senator's coffin after it was placed here at the Kennedy Library on Thursday night, and had an honor guard, a military honor guard, and members of the staff who took turns sitting by the coffin through the night. Tom, just remind us again, we're going to have a brief religious moment when the senator arrives. Will there be any other speeches?
We don't know yet, Tom. We do know that Father Dan Coughlin, who is the chaplain of the House, will say a few words. Nobody else at this moment is scheduled to say anything, although there has been some speculation that if any member of the Kennedy family wanted to talk to the members of the Senate who have come out, the staffers, as well as his colleagues here, Senator Byrd and others, this might be the occasion to do so. They're running nearly 2 hours behind schedule, Tom, but it's fair to say that this crowd has not thinned out. If anything, it's actually grown, and certainly there has to be a good deal of relief that the sun has managed to slide behind the cloud. We've lost some humidity. We have a nice breeze now as the people of Washington and the surrounding areas come out to honor a man who spent 47 years of his life in this institution and contributing not only to the causes of the country and the Democratic Party, but so many people here would argue changed their lives in one fashion or another and made an impact.
And no doubt some of those people gathered on the steps of the Capitol were drawn to Washington, inspired maybe originally by the Kennedys, maybe by President John F. Kennedy, who did in fact animate an entire new generation of people in public policy with his famous inaugural address and the inauguration as well of the Peace Corps and the idea of public service. And then Senator Kennedy was a great liberal hero to so many young people who were of that political persuasion, just as Ronald Reagan was to another generation of young people when he was elected president in 1980, and created an entire generation of young conservatives who came to Washington and have stayed as well. Motorcade now moving at a more stately pace through the streets of the Capitol. Senator Kennedy has not been there much at all in the last year, obviously. He was there for the inauguration, made one or two other brief visits. He spent most of his time either in Florida or at the family compound in Hyannisport. He was being treated here in the Boston area. He had a particularly virulent form of brain cancer, a tumor that, as one expert said, there's just not a hell of a lot that you can do. That's a direct quote. And at the moment that he was diagnosed, he knew that it was not a good end game for him. They did obviously go through treatment, but in fact, the chances of survival were going to be very slim indeed. The irony is that Ted Kennedy was one of the original promoters of the war on cancer, which was begun during the Nixon administration. He was one of those who believed that we should begin to find a way to wipe out cancer. Health has always been an important component of his political and public life. It's been true as well in the mental health services. His family had a very difficult experience with Rosemary Kennedy, who was born with some defects, and unfortunately she was lobotomized. It was a treatment that they used at the time. The family lived with that forever, and it inspired Eunice Kennedy to start the Special Olympics for people who had some mental, if not disabilities, some cognitive skills that needed some attention, or even some physical skills that needed some attention, that they too would have an arena in which to compete. And Senator Kennedy was certainly a supporter of that. That again was something that was supported across partisan lines. It was neither a Republican nor a Democratic program. It was much more of a humanitarian program. I think I know where we are now, and I would say that we're probably another, at that pace, 4 to 5 minutes away from the Capitol. Are you watching that, Tom Costello? Can you see it?
It's, I believe, Tom, we're looking at the House side now. The House side of, so Independence Avenue, crossing in that vicinity and now approaching. Yes, we are indeed. Here they come in front of us now.
Okay, that's where we are. Okay.
And we have an ovation, Tom. I don't know if you can hear that.
I can. Let's just watch this moment play out now. There's not a good deal that we can add to it.
Mrs. Kennedy, we gather with you, the family and dear friends, to express our solidarity with you at this time. Some members of both chambers of Congress, officers, co-workers, collaborators, and especially former and presently serving staff of the senator are gathered here on the steps. Here we are to briefly pray with you, offer our sympathy, and to thank you. Thank you for sharing the senator and so much of his life with us. And thank you also for your love and your care throughout the years, especially during the time of illness and these last moments. Be assured of our prayers and anything we can do for you as you move on. Let us pray. Though in the sight of people, your servant, Senator Ted Kennedy, suffered greatly and took on enormous tasks, Lord, you knew his hopes were unquenchable, full of immortality. You knew his strengths and his limitations. He knew you, Lord. He knew you could use anyone or anything to accomplish your purpose and draw people closer to one another and to his divine presence. Grounded in faith, fashioned by family values, and once expanded to a world vision, true contemplative leadership would draw staff and friends to new depths of human understanding. Embraced with compassion, such a vision would inspire people around the world to believe with all their hearts that peace and justice will conquer violence and division, and competition can be converted to collaboration. Although burdened by the weight of his passing, Lord, help his co-workers and collaborators raise the torch of his convictions and commitments for a new generation, one yet even to be born, and to all in all those parts of this nation and the world who are still untouched by the social responsibility inherent in every aspect of human freedom. Faithful servant of the people and longtime spokesman for government of the people, go now to your place of rest and meet the Lord your God. We thank you, Lord, for the short time you have given us to work together, to be together. To you be all honor, power, glory, and praise, now and forever. Amen.
Father Daniel Coughlin, who is the House of Representatives chaplain. I'm Tom Brokaw. This is a special edition of NBC Nightly News. Continuing coverage.
I would like to introduce
the final day
Samuel
of
Bonds,
Senator
Director,
Edward M. Kennedy, who will be buried beside his brother Robert Kennedy and the late President John F. Kennedy at Arlington National Cemetery in the next hour or so. This is a stop at the nation's capital.
Oh, beautiful, for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesty, above thy fruited plain. America, America, God shed his grace on thee and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea.
It was so appropriate to have the prayer from Father Coughlin. Roman Catholic faith was central to the life of Senator Kennedy, even when he strayed or sometimes crashed off the straight and narrow life. He always came back to the church. That's his son Patrick that you see in the foreground, standing guard at the hearse that bears the body of his father.
Thank you very much for attending. Eternal rest grant unto him, O Lord, and let perpetual light shine upon him. May he rest in peace. May his soul and all the souls of the faithfully departed, through the mercy of God, rest in peace. Amen.
Senator Bobby Byrd talking with Lawrence Tribe in the background. There was no detailed program for this part of the motorcade, so we'll just ask you to bear with us. We don't know quite what to expect next. I think that might have been the conclusion of what they wanted to do here, was to give an opportunity to the Senate staffers to come out. Pat Leahy is the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, in which, and that's Chuck Robb, a former senator from Virginia, and Linda Bird Robb, the daughter of the late President Lyndon Johnson. Briefly, you saw Ethel Kennedy. There was Gene Kennedy Smith, who was the last member of the original family of Joe Kennedy. Father Creedon, who helped preside here at the memorial service last night and part of the services today.
just want to say on behalf of my brother and sister how proud my dad was to serve here in the Senate, and most of all to know that he couldn't have done it without all the people that he worked with. He knew that he was only great because he had great people supporting him, and he knew the value of good staff, and that's why he was so successful. And I know that all of you, having watched what happened the last 3 days, have to feel good that you are part of his life, because this country has outpoured its soul and heart this last few days to say what a difference he's made in the life of this country. And I think that you all today should be feeling like you are part of that too, because of all that you've done to be part of the same legacy that he wanted for this country. And I hope that you feel some consolation that the many, many hard hours that you put into the nitty-gritty of legislating and policy making gives you some sense of satisfaction at having done a really important job for this country, because that's the legacy he would want you to feel good about. And he'd be very proud to see you all out here today paying a final respect and tribute to his memory. And I thank you on behalf of my family for being here.
That's Congressman Patrick Kennedy, who represents a district in Rhode Island. He's the youngest son of Senator Kennedy. Off to the side was his brother, Ted Kennedy, Jr. And they were also accompanied by their sister, Kara. Norma Netta, former congressman from California. Some laughter will be gone from the Capitol without the presence of Ted Kennedy. He entered a room laughing and left laughing. He interrupted. Sometimes it was hard to decode exactly what he was saying because he'd burst into laughter in the middle of statements and descriptions of what was going on. He had the best eye that I knew in Washington for giving you the kind of unvarnished truth about where the pressure points were on both sides of the aisle. He was a keen student of the political process. He loved it. He brought all of his intellectual and physical energy to that building and every day worked it hard. But most of all, he had a great appetite for life. One of his close friends said to me in the last 24 hours or so, he was a trip. And I think a lot of people felt that way about him across party lines. There are those, of course, who feel very strongly that he should not be getting the kind of encomiums he is because of his personal deportment. But I think that this outpouring in the Capitol and in Boston, and the tributes from Senator McCain and Senator Hatch last night and the other Republicans who showed up today bring a whole other dimension to Senator Kennedy in terms of his personal generosity that a lot of people didn't know about. One of the first statements released upon his death came from Nancy Reagan, the wife of Ronald Reagan, obviously, and she paid tribute to him, and she also expressed quite deliberately her gratitude for his support of her position on stem cell research, which remains a contentious issue in the political culture in this country. There is a kind of a bond between these families that rise to these heights. President George Bush, the 43rd, is at the funeral today with Laura Bush. One of the first moves that he made in Washington when he became president was to reach across the aisle to Senator Kennedy and to work on some common goals in public education in this country. The Bush family has its own distinguished record, obviously, in public life. George Bush, 41, was a member of Congress. His father before him was a senator. President Bush, 41, served 2 terms as vice president, 1 term as president of the United States. This is very reminiscent of different circumstances when there was a spontaneous gathering on the Capitol steps right after 9/11 and singing of God Bless America. Now a bittersweet day as those staffers and other workers in the Capitol say goodbye to one of the most familiar figures ever to walk the corridors of the Capitol Hill, and that would be Senator Ted Kennedy. As the motorcade now makes its way to Arlington National Cemetery, and we'll pick up the ceremonies there in a moment, I'm going to ask my colleague Andrea Mitchell back in our Washington Bureau to help us kind of summarize the day. Andrea?
Thanks, Tom. This long, emotional day began with a funeral mass for the man President Obama described as the heir to a weighty legacy, a champion for those who had none, and the soul of the Democratic Party. The heavens were weeping for Teddy Kennedy today. Awaiting him at the Basilica of Our Lady of Perpetual Help, his wife Vicki, a pillar of strength through his battle with cancer. His sister Jean, now the sole survivor of her generation. First wife Joan, Sergeant Shriver, afflicted with Alzheimer's, and daughter Maria. In an achingly sad moment, the 3 widows, Vicki, Jean, and brother Robert's wife Ethel, tenderly spread the white cloth, known as a pall, to mark the sign of resurrection, of new life beyond this one, as the casket was received into the church, escorted by his children, grandchildren, nieces, and nephews, with musical tributes by close friends, Yo-Yo Ma, and Placido Domingo. It was here 7 years ago that the late senator prayed every day for his daughter Cara, then fighting lung cancer.
He shall defend the afflicted among the people and save the children of the poor.
Today, the public and private came together, Republicans and Democrats equally touched by the last of the original Kennedy brothers, honored today by 3 of the 4 surviving former presidents and the current president. Above all else, today was a window into the family man, comforter to those left fatherless by the death of his brothers, and to his own children and grandchildren, who today also gave thanks for his life.
For my grandfather's commitment and persistence, not to outworn values, but to old values that will never wear out. That the poor may be out of political fashion, but they are never without human need.
For my grandfather's brave promise last summer that the work begins anew, the hope rises again, and the dream lives on.
And his sons, who honored the father who gave them strength through their struggles and tragedies.
My name is Ted Kennedy, Jr. Although it hasn't been easy at times to live with this name, I've never been more proud of it than I am today.
A father who gently taught a life lesson to a 12-year-old who had just lost his leg to bone cancer.
And as I struggled to walk, I slipped and I fell on the ice, and I started to cry. And I said, I can't do this. I said, I'll never be able to climb up that hill. And he lifted me up in his strong, gentle arms and said something I will never forget. He said, I know you can do it. There is nothing that you can't do. We're going to climb that hill together, even if it takes us all day. He taught me that nothing is impossible.
And Patrick, the Rhode Island congressman, revealing the private yearnings of a lonely child whose crippling asthma attacks kept his father at his bedside.
I couldn't have seen it at the time, but having asthma was like hitting the jackpot for a child who craved his father's love and attention.
The demons of Patrick's struggle with substance abuse led to father and son jointly sponsoring a bill to extend medical coverage for mental illness.
I felt he was also fighting for me to help ease the burden of stigma and shame that accompanies treatment.
And the eulogy by President Obama.
We do not weep for him today because of the prestige attached to his name or his office. We weep because we loved this kind and tender hero who persevered through pain and tragedy, not for the sake of ambition or vanity, not for wealth or power, but only for the people and the country that he loved.
Finally, to the strains of America the Beautiful. Edward Moore Kennedy left his beloved Boston for the last time. And tonight, he rejoins his brother, both brothers, at Arlington National Cemetery. Tom?
Thank you, Andrea. Andrea, I'm curious about what impact his death and all these tributes to his ability to reach across partisan lines will have now in the short term in the Congress of the United States, on the House side and on the Senate side. Or the fact that he's gone, do you think will just revert to business as usual?
I don't see how they can after the powerful examples that have been taught and learned in the last few days. And I covered the Senate when it was a very different place and covered Senator Kennedy and know some of the traditions, and that has to be an important teaching moment. Tom?
All right, thanks very much, NBC's Andrea Mitchell. We'll have continuing coverage of the final day of Senator Edward Moore Kennedy, his last trip to the nation's capital, now headed for Arlington National Cemetery in a moment. We're back now with the funeral and the burial of Senator Ted Kennedy of Massachusetts, now headed to Arlington National Cemetery in that motorcade, followed by family and friends. They've just made a brief stop at the nation's capital. NBC's Tom Costello is there for us with a report tonight. Tom?
And Tom, good evening to you. And in fact, the people on the steps behind me, on the steps of the Capitol, are now starting to dissipate and leave for the evening on what has turned out to be a beautiful night here. Senator Kennedy's career spanned 10 presidents, 5 Democrats, 5 Republicans. He himself authored 300 bills. He was part of 2,500 bills or resolutions. It was that commitment to the country and this institution that they celebrated here today. Ted Kennedy's final journey through Washington was met by thousands of ordinary Americans who stood under a blazing August sun to pay their last respects.
He meant so much, it's hard to even put into words.
It's hard to imagine the Senate and the country without him.
Finally, a pause at an institution he loved dearly. On the steps of the Capitol, hundreds of colleagues, his current and former staffers, who had come to honor a man they lovingly called the Lion of the Senate.
Faithful servant of the people and longtime spokesman for government of the people, go now to your place of rest and meet the Lord your God.
For 47 years, Capitol Hill was in Ted Kennedy's blood. His career in the Senate spanned 10 presidents, as he sponsored more than 2,500 bills and resolutions, from civil rights and education to health care and immigration, wars in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, Supreme Court nominees, and the election of the first African-American president. 54-year-old Michael Johnson is today the Senate's Deputy Assistant Sergeant at Arms. He first met Senator Kennedy 45 years ago when he was a 9-year-old paper boy. One day, the senator asked to see Michael's report card, then offered Michael a deal.
How about if I give you $1 for every A you bring me on your report card every semester? And I said, really? You're going to do that? And he said, sure. And I said, okay, you got a deal.
That started a lifelong friendship. Kennedy eventually wrote the letter that got Michael Johnson into Cornell University. Today, Johnson was on the steps of the Capitol paying tribute to his former mentor, as Washington said farewell. Still to be determined who will fill Senator Kennedy's seat. As you probably know, before he passed away, he asked the Massachusetts Assembly to give the authority to the governor there to appoint a caretaker before a special election is held, partly because this health care debate rages on Capitol Hill, something he felt passionately about. Tom?
Thank you very much, NBC's Tom Costello. That's still to be worked out in this very politically active state, obviously. One astute observer of Massachusetts politics sent me a text message today saying Ted Kennedy Jr. gets the seat after his eulogy. Well, we'll see about all of that. The motorcade now is making its way to Arlington National Cemetery. NBC's Jim Miklaszewski is there, and he has a kind of a preview of what we can expect when they arrive. Jim?
Tom, once Senator Kennedy arrives here at Arlington National Cemetery, he will receive a congressional funeral ceremony. Not as elaborate as President Kennedy's full state funeral, but once Senator Kennedy's casket arrives at graveside, he will get full military honors. A 9-member military casket team led by officer in charge, Army Captain Derek Anderson, and only close family members and friends and the family will be at graveside as the former Archbishop of Washington, Cardinal Theodore McCarrick, delivers a graveside ceremony. After that, there will be the standard military 7-member Army team firing off a volley of 3 shots. There will be an Army bugler sounding taps, and then, of course, the folded flag presented to the family. And Senator Kennedy will then be buried alongside his 2 brothers, President Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. But ever since the assassination of President Kennedy nearly 46 years ago, for these 3 brothers, Arlington Cemetery appeared to be their destiny. It's considered America's most hallowed ground. More than 300,000 service members from every American war are buried at Arlington National Cemetery. The day after President John F. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd, 1963, wife Jacqueline came here to personally select the Kennedy gravesite. On a hillside overlooking Washington, the site covers 3 acres and contains the graves of President Kennedy, Jacqueline, 2 of their infant children, and brother Robert Kennedy, assassinated while running for president in 1968. At Robert's burial, Ted Kennedy was the first to receive his brother's flag. And it seemed inevitable Senator Kennedy would be buried alongside his brothers.
It becomes a kind of shrine, if you will, almost a point of visitation for people who come to Washington and want to pay homage to the memory of the Kennedy brothers and the Kennedy family.
But Arlington is more than a burial ground. A visit here can almost be spiritual. The pomp and precision of a full honors military service are vivid reminders of the tremendous sacrifice of America's fallen. Those buried here include President William Howard Taft and Generals John Pershing and Omar Bradley. The remains of 7 astronauts who died aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger share a single grave. There's also a memorial for big band leader Glenn Miller, whose plane disappeared while on tour entertaining troops during World War II. But Arlington also holds a whole new generation of war dead. Senator Kennedy often attended funerals for the service members from Massachusetts killed in Iraq or Afghanistan. Even one of today's military pallbearers was personally touched by Kennedy. Sergeant John Kenney says when his mother was short on money, Kennedy helped her get medical care.
In my family, it's just he's an icon, he's a hero.
Senator Kennedy's grave will be marked by a simple white cross and a small marble slab, just like his brother's Robert's. Tom.
Thanks very much, NBC Jim Miklaszewski tonight. I said earlier in the special report that a number of families from victims in the Iraq and the Afghanistan war, those who've lost their lives there, have been asked to delay their burials at Arlington National Cemetery because they're so backed up. They're burying about 27 veterans a day there now. Part of that, of course, is the result of the World War II generation dying at an ever accelerated rate as they get into their mid and late 80s and into their 90s. It's hard to know exactly what the mortality rate is, but best estimates are about 1,300 to 1,500 World War II veterans are dying every day, to say nothing of those veterans of Korea. And even now we're beginning to lose people from Vietnam at an ever greater rate. So there's been some unhappiness on the part of families, understandably, of those who've lost young men or young women now in Iraq or in Afghanistan. But there's not much that can be done about it in the short term. Michael Beschloss, final thoughts. The place of the Kennedys, has it come to an end, or do we begin a new chapter?
Well, it's come to an end in terms of a Kennedy being a prime figure in national life. That was true from the time that John Kennedy was elected until just a couple of days ago when Ted Kennedy passed. But, you know, Tom, as we've discussed before, you know, when you look at it in terms of history, you know, the dividing lines are not that sharp. And a life oftentimes happens after someone leaves the center of the stage. And I think Ted Kennedy's legacy, that of his two brothers, will live on and influence American leaders and American citizens for a very long time to come.
Thanks very much, NBC's consulting historian Michael Beschloss. No one better to do that for us. In the last 48 hours, the American people have had a more intimate look at Senator Edward Kennedy, who for so many years was a kind of a caricature for so many people. But they've learned about his generosity, about his passion for public life, about his role in his own family. And now Edward Kennedy is gone from the national stage, but his legacy will continue. This has been a special edition of NBC Nightly News. I'm Tom Brokaw, NBC News, at the John F. Kennedy Presidential Library in Boston, Massachusetts. We'll have continuing coverage on MSNBC. Thanks for joining us.